1. Redefining masculinity beyond power. What if masculinity was never about dominance, but about discipline? In much of modern discourse, masculinity is either aggressively glorified or reflexively dismantled. On one end of the spectrum, masculinity is framed as dominance, control, physical power, and social authority. On the other, it is treated as a problematic construct, something to be apologized for, softened, or erased. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons enter this polarized cultural landscape with a fundamentally different proposition. Masculinity is not defined by how much power a man wields, but by how well he governs himself under God. This redefinition is not merely rhetorical. It is theological, ethical, and deeply practical. Mitchell consistently reframes masculinity away from external markers, status, strength, charisma, or control, and toward internal formation, discipline, obedience, responsibility, and moral clarity. In doing so, he challenges both cultural machismo and cultural passivity, rejecting the false dichotomy that men must choose between domination and disappearance. At the heart of Mitchell's teaching is a simple but unsettling claim. Power does not make a man masculine, restraint does. Masculinity and the illusion of power. Culturally, masculinity has long been associated with power, political power, economic power, physical power, and sexual power. Men are taught implicitly and explicitly that to be a real man is to be in charge, to be unchallenged, to assert oneself and prevail. Mitchell directly confronts this narrative by exposing its spiritual emptiness. Power, he argues, is morally neutral at best and corrupting at worst when it is not governed by character. In his sermons, Mitchell frequently emphasizes that power without discipline produces chaos, not leadership. A man who can command others but cannot command his own appetites is not strong. He is simply unchecked. A man who dominates conversations, relationships, or institutions without moral accountability is not leading. He is compensating. This critique resonates deeply with biblical anthropology. Scripture consistently portrays unrestrained power as destructive. From Saul's insecurity-driven kingship to Samson's physically impressive but morally undisciplined life. Mitchell draws from this theological tradition to argue that masculinity divorced from discipline becomes performative rather than formative. It creates men who look powerful but lack substance. Discipline as the true marker of masculinity. Mitchell's reframing hinges on discipline, not as ascetic self-denial for its own sake, but as ordered strength. Discipline, in his sermons, is the capacity to submit one's desires, emotions, and ambitions to a higher moral authority. It is the internal structure that allows a man to carry responsibility without collapsing under it. This is where Mitchell's vision diverges sharply from cultural caricatures. In popular media, discipline is often associated with emotional repression or rigid control. Mitchell, however, presents discipline as freedom rightly ordered. A disciplined man is not less human. He is more integrated. His emotions are acknowledged but not enthroned. His strength is real but restrained. His ambition exists but is subordinated to purpose. Crucially, Mitchell frames discipline as preparatory. Masculinity, in this view, is not something proven through conquest, but something cultivated through consistency. Daily faithfulness, moral obedience, and private integrity matter more than public recognition. This emphasis lays the groundwork for leadership, which Mitchell will later argue cannot be sustained without internal governance. Submission before authority. One of the most countercultural aspects of Mitchell's teaching is his insistence that masculinity begins with submission, not to other men, but to God. In a world where submission is often equated with weakness, Mitchell reclaims it as the prerequisite for legitimate authority. A man who refuses to submit, Mitchell argues, will inevitably misuse power when he gains it. Submission to God provides the moral boundaries that prevent authority from becoming tyranny. It teaches a man that he is accountable, finite, and dependent, realities that are essential for responsible leadership. This theological framing dismantles the myth of the self-made man. Masculinity is not self-generated, it is received and stewarded. Mitchell's sermons consistently emphasize that men are not autonomous centers of meaning but entrusted agents. This understanding shifts masculinity from entitlement to obligation, a theme that will be developed further in discussions of responsibility. Emotional control without emotional erasure. Another critical dimension of Mitchell's redefinition is emotional maturity. Rather than promoting emotional suppression, Mitchell calls men to emotional regulation. He rejects the notion that emotional expression is inherently unmasculine, but he is equally critical of emotional impulsivity. In his sermons, anger, fear, insecurity, and desire are acknowledged as human realities. However, masculinity is measured by how these emotions are processed, not merely felt. A man is not weak for experiencing fear, he is weak if fear dictates his decisions. He is not unmanly for feeling anger, he is unfit for leadership if anger governs his behavior. This balanced approach avoids two extremes: stoic denial and emotional volatility. It prepares men to lead with clarity rather than reaction, a necessary foundation for the relational and communal leadership Mitchell later emphasizes. Masculinity as formation, not performance. One of the most significant implications of Mitchell's framework is that masculinity is formative rather than performative. It is not proven through isolated acts of heroism or dominance, but revealed through long-term patterns of obedience and restraint. Performance-oriented masculinity seeks validation, applause, admiration, fear, or sexual conquest. Formative masculinity seeks alignment with God's standards, with moral truth, and with enduring purpose. Mitchell repeatedly warns against confusing visibility with validity. A man may be loud, influential, and admired while remaining spiritually immature and morally unstable. By contrast, a disciplined man may be unnoticed, uncelebrated, and unseen, yet deeply trustworthy. This inversion of values sets the stage for Mitchell's later teachings on leadership, where visibility increases but self-governance must already be in place. Preparing the ground for leadership and responsibility. This redefinition of masculinity is not an endpoint. It is a foundation. Mitchell's sermons consistently build from internal formation toward external responsibility. Masculinity beyond power creates the conditions for leadership that does not exploit and responsibility that is not resented. Without this redefinition, leadership becomes authoritarian and responsibility becomes burdensome. With it, leadership becomes service and responsibility becomes vocation. A man who understands masculinity as discipline rather than dominance is prepared to lead without abusing and to carry responsibility without collapsing. Thus, Mitchell's reframing is strategic as well as theological. Before addressing leadership structures, family roles, or societal influence, he insists on redefining what kind of men are fit to occupy those spaces. Power must follow character, not precede it. Conclusion: strength. Reimagined, Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons invite men to abandon shallow definitions of masculinity rooted in power and embrace a deeper, more demanding vision rooted in discipline. This masculinity does not seek to control others, but to master the self. It does not deny strength, but refines it. It does not chase authority, but prepares to steward it. By redefining masculinity beyond power, Mitchell lays the essential groundwork for his broader teachings on leadership and responsibility. Only disciplined men, he argues, can be trusted with influence. Only submitted men can exercise authority without corruption. And only formed men, not performing men, can leave a legacy worth inheriting. This foundational vision sets the stage for the next discussion: how such masculinity translates into leadership that begins not on platforms, but in private life. 2. Masculinity as moral weight, not privilege. True masculinity begins the moment a man realizes his life is not just his own. If Part 1 redefines masculinity beyond power, Part 2 presses the question further. What then is masculinity for? Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons answer with uncompromising clarity. Masculinity is not a social advantage to be enjoyed, but a moral weight to be carried. To be a man, in Mitchell's theological framework, is to live under obligation rather than entitlement, responsibility rather than reward. This shift, from privilege to weight, is essential for understanding Mitchell's broader vision of leadership. He consistently warns that when masculinity is framed as privilege, leadership becomes exploitative. But when masculinity is understood as moral weight, leadership becomes sacrificial. This distinction forms the backbone of his preaching and sharply contrasts with both secular power models and shallow religious masculinities. Privilege and the cultural misreading of manhood. In many societies, masculinity has historically been linked to advantage, greater freedom, authority, and social leeway. Even as cultural narratives change, traces of this assumption remain. Men are often subtly taught that leadership is owed to them, that responsibility is optional, and that consequences can be deflected or deferred. Mitchell directly confronts this assumption by reframing masculinity as increased accountability rather than increased access. In his sermons, men are reminded that privilege, where it exists, does not excuse moral failure. It intensifies judgment. To be entrusted with influence, strength, or voice is to be held to a higher standard, not a lower one. This perspective echoes biblical patterns in which calling always precedes accountability. From Adam's charge in Eden to the prophetic burden carried by Old Testament leaders, authority is consistently paired with obligation. Mitchell draws from this tradition to argue that masculinity cannot be detached from ethical consequence. The weight of being accountable to God and others. Central to Mitchell's teaching is the idea that a man's life is never lived in isolation. Masculinity, therefore, is inherently relational. A man's decisions shape families, communities, and futures. To live as though one's actions affect no one else is, in Mitchell's words, not freedom, but moral negligence. He repeatedly emphasizes that masculinity places a man under a double accountability: vertical accountability to God and horizontal accountability to people. This dual axis prevents masculinity from becoming either authoritarian or self-indulgent. A man answers upward for his obedience and outward for his stewardship. This framework fundamentally alters how responsibility is perceived. Responsibility is no longer a burden imposed by external expectations, but an intrinsic dimension of manhood itself. To reject responsibility is not merely to avoid inconvenience, it is to abdicate identity. Masculinity and the burden of choice. Mitchell often highlights choice as one of the heaviest aspects of masculinity. Men, he argues, are frequently positioned by role, influence, or expectation to make decisions that affect others. These decisions cannot be made impulsively, emotionally, or selfishly without causing harm. In his sermons, Mitchell critiques a culture that celebrates personal freedom while minimizing the moral consequences of choice. Masculinity, in contrast, requires a willingness to choose rightly, even when the cost is personal loss. This includes choices that are unseen, unrewarded, and uncelebrated. The burden of choice reinforces the necessity of discipline introduced in Part 1. Without internal formation, the weight of decision-making becomes overwhelming or corrupting. Thus, Masculinity as moral weight cannot exist without masculinity as self-governance. Rejecting victimhood and entitlement simultaneously. One of the most nuanced aspects of Mitchell's preaching is his refusal to allow men to retreat into either victimhood or entitlement. He acknowledges structural and personal challenges men face, but he does not allow these realities to excuse irresponsibility. In Mitchell's framework, suffering does not nullify obligation. Difficulty does not erase duty. Instead, hardship intensifies the call to moral clarity. Masculinity is revealed not by the absence of struggle, but by faithfulness within it. This stance is countercultural in two directions. It rejects narratives that excuse male failure through grievance, and it rejects narratives that justify male dominance through tradition. In both cases, Mitchell returns to responsibility as the defining marker of manhood. Masculinity and sacrificial orientation. Perhaps the most striking feature of Mitchell's vision is its sacrificial orientation. Masculinity is not about what a man can extract from the world, but about what he is willing to give for the good of others. This echoes the Christological model that undergirds much of his preaching: authority exercised through sacrifice, strength demonstrated through service. Sacrifice, in this sense, is not performative martyrdom, but sustained faithfulness. It is the daily willingness to prioritize duty over desire, calling over comfort, and obedience over recognition. Mitchell stresses that such sacrifice is not a loss of self, but a fulfillment of purpose. This understanding directly prepares the ground for leadership. Leadership divorced from sacrifice becomes exploitation. Leadership rooted in sacrifice becomes trust. Masculinity as preparation for leadership. Mitchell does not rush men into leadership roles. Instead, he emphasizes preparation through responsibility. Before a man leads publicly, he must carry weight privately. Before he speaks with authority, he must live with accountability. This progression underscores Mitchell's insistence that leadership is not an entitlement of masculinity, but its testing ground. Masculinity proves itself in how a man handles weight before it ever handles power. By framing masculinity as moral weight, Mitchell filters out those seeking status rather than service. Only men willing to carry responsibility without applause are fit to carry influence without corruption. Implications for responsibility and authority. This understanding of masculinity naturally leads into Mitchell's later sermons on responsibility and authority. Once masculinity is established as obligation rather than privilege, responsibility becomes inevitable rather than negotiable. Authority becomes stewardship rather than domination. Masculinity as moral weight also reframes failure. When a man fails, the issue is not merely personal disappointment, but breached trust. This heightens the seriousness of moral formation and deepens the call to repentance and restoration rather than denial or deflection. Conclusion: the cost of being a man. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons challenge men to embrace a costly vision of masculinity, one that rejects entitlement and accepts responsibility as identity. Masculinity, in this framework, is not a prize to be claimed, but a burden to be borne with integrity. This vision does not diminish men, it dignifies them. It assumes they are capable of discipline, sacrifice, and moral clarity. It calls them not to comfort, but to calling. And it insists that leadership, when it comes, must rest on the shoulders of men already accustomed to weight. Having established masculinity as moral weight rather than privilege, the next discussion turns to where this weight must first be carried. In private life, long before public leadership ever begins. 3. Leadership that starts in private life. If a man cannot lead himself in private, he has no business leading others in public. Having redefined masculinity beyond power, Part 1, and reframed it as moral weight rather than privilege, Part 2, Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons now turn to the inevitable question of leadership. But Mitchell approaches leadership not from the stage, the institution, or the title. Instead, he begins where leadership is least visible and most revealing: private life. For Mitchell, leadership does not originate in public recognition, but in private obedience. Public authority is not the starting point of leadership. It is its outcome. This inversion stands in sharp contrast to contemporary leadership cultures that prioritize visibility, charisma, and platform over character. Mitchell insists that the unseen life of a man, his habits, decisions, and disciplines when no one is watching, is the true measure of his fitness to lead. The hidden life as the testing ground of leadership. Mitchell repeatedly emphasizes that private life functions as a proving ground. It is in solitude, family, and routine responsibility that a man demonstrates whether he can be trusted with influence. The absence of witnesses does not diminish accountability, it intensifies it. In his sermons, Mitchell often warns against confusing public success with moral legitimacy. A man may preach, manage, or inspire effectively while privately indulging in compromise, negligence, or hypocrisy. Such leadership, Mitchell argues, is inherently unstable. When private life contradicts public image, leadership becomes performative rather than transformative. This emphasis aligns with biblical patterns in which leaders are formed in obscurity long before they are elevated. David tends sheep before leading a nation. Moses shepherds in Midian before confronting Pharaoh. Mitchell draws on these narratives to argue that leadership without private formation is premature and dangerous. Self-leadership as the first responsibility. At the core of Mitchell's teaching is the principle of self-leadership. Before a man can guide others, he must govern himself. This includes mastery over time, habits, speech, desire, and emotional responses. Self-leadership is not self-obsession, it is self-discipline oriented towards service. Mitchell rejects the notion that self-leadership is optional or secondary. In his framework, failure at this level disqualifies a man from broader leadership, regardless of talent or gifting. Charisma cannot substitute for character. Skill cannot compensate for moral instability. This emphasis reinforces the connection between masculinity and discipline established in Part 1. Leadership is not a separate category added later. It is the outward expression of an inwardly ordered life. Integrity in the absence of applause. Private life exposes a man's relationship with integrity. Without applause, incentives, or social pressure, choices reveal true priorities. Mitchell frequently challenges men to consider who they are when obedience costs them comfort but yields no recognition. Integrity, in this context, is not perfection, but consistency. It is the alignment between belief and behavior across contexts. A man who honors commitments, controls his speech, and resists temptation in private demonstrates readiness for responsibility in public. Mitchell contrasts this with performative leadership, where morality is maintained only when observed. Such leadership, he warns, eventually collapses under scrutiny because it lacks internal coherence. Family and close relationships as leadership laboratories. Mitchell gives particular attention to family and intimate relationships as critical arenas of leadership formation. How a man treats his spouse, children, and closest relationships reveals more about his leadership capacity than any public role. In his sermons, Mitchell emphasizes that leadership begins with presence, patience, and responsibility in these contexts. Authority exercised without love, consistency, or sacrifice is not leadership, but control. A man who demands respect publicly while neglecting relational responsibility privately undermines his own credibility. This focus also reinforces masculinity as moral weight. Family leadership is not about asserting dominance, but about bearing responsibility for the well-being of others. It requires emotional regulation, humility, and endurance, qualities that cannot be faked for long. The discipline of daily faithfulness. Leadership formation, as Mitchell presents it, is deeply unglamorous. It is built through daily faithfulness rather than dramatic moments. Consistent prayer, ethical work, and responsible living shape a man more profoundly than occasional acts of heroism. Mitchell critiques a culture that seeks shortcuts to influence, viral moments, rapid promotion, or symbolic gestures. He argues that leadership forged quickly often fractures under pressure because it lacks depth. Private discipline provides the resilience necessary for sustained leadership. This understanding reinforces the idea that leadership is not seized, but entrusted. Trust grows slowly, through patterns observed over time. The danger of platform before formation. One of Mitchell's most urgent warnings concerns the danger of platform preceding formation. In religious and secular contexts alike, individuals are often elevated for talent rather than tested for character. Mitchell sees this as a recipe for moral failure and institutional harm. He emphasizes that leadership amplifies what already exists. If private life is disordered, leadership magnifies disorder. If character is unstable, authority accelerates collapse. Thus, private formation is not merely preparatory, it is protective. This insight connects directly to responsibility, the focus of later sections. Authority without responsibility is destructive. Responsibility without formation is overwhelming. Private life is where capacity for both is built. Accountability as a private discipline. Mitchell also underscores accountability as an essential component of private leadership. A man who refuses accountability, even in private, is unfit for public trust. Accountability is not a threat to leadership, it is its safeguard. In Mitchell's sermons, accountability involves inviting correction, confessing failure, and submitting to communal and divine standards. This posture prevents isolation and self-deception, two of the most common causes of leadership failure. Preparing for public responsibility. Private leadership does not remain private forever. Its purpose is preparation, not retreat. Mitchell is clear that disciplined private life equips men to lead publicly without being corrupted by visibility. When leadership eventually expands beyond private contexts, the habits formed in obscurity determine how power is exercised. Men who have learned to obey without being seen can be trusted to lead without abusing. Conclusion. Leadership begins where no one is watching. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons offer a sobering yet hopeful vision of leadership. Leadership does not begin with titles, platforms, or recognition. It begins in private obedience, self-governance, and relational responsibility. By insisting that leadership starts in private life, Mitchell protects leadership from ego and grounds it in integrity. This vision flows naturally from masculinity understood as discipline and moral weight. Only men accustomed to carrying responsibility in obscurity are prepared to carry influence in public. With this foundation established, the next discussion turns to responsibility itself, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete demand placed on men entrusted with leadership and authority. 4. Responsibility as the core of biblical manhood. Responsibility is the price men pay for being trusted with influence. After redefining masculinity beyond power, Part 1, reframing it as moral weight rather than privilege, Part 2, and locating leadership in private life, Part 3, Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons arrive at what may be their most demanding claim. Responsibility is not a secondary expectation of manhood. It is its core. In Mitchell's theological framework, masculinity without responsibility is not incomplete. It is invalid. Responsibility, as Mitchell presents it, is not a social role imposed externally, but a spiritual calling embedded within biblical manhood itself. To be a man is to be answerable for one's actions, for one's influence, and for the lives one touches. This conviction undergirds Mitchell's critique of modern leadership failures and his insistence that authority cannot exist apart from accountability. Responsibility as identity, not obligation. One of Mitchell's most radical assertions is that responsibility is not something a man has, it is something a man is. This distinction matters. When responsibility is treated merely as obligation, it can be negotiated, postponed, or resented. When it is understood as identity, it becomes inseparable from self-understanding. In his sermons, Mitchell consistently rejects the language of inconvenience. Responsibility is not a burden unfairly assigned, it is the defining feature of manhood. A man who rejects responsibility is not asserting freedom, he is rejecting formation. This perspective reframes maturity itself. Growing into manhood is not about expanding options, but about embracing accountability. This view draws deeply from biblical anthropology. From the opening chapters of Genesis, humanity, and particularly men, are portrayed as entrusted stewards. Adam is given responsibility before he is given companionship or authority. Mitchell highlights this sequence to emphasize that responsibility precedes role and power. The relationship between responsibility and authority. Mitchell repeatedly insists that responsibility must always precede authority. Authority without responsibility becomes domination. Responsibility without authority becomes frustration. Biblical manhood requires both, but always in the proper order. In his sermons, Mitchell critiques leadership structures that elevate men to authority before they have demonstrated responsibility. Titles, platforms, and recognition often arrive faster than character formation. When this happens, authority becomes detached from accountability, and leadership degenerates into self-protection rather than service. Responsibility, in Mitchell's framework, functions as a filter. Only men willing to carry responsibility without recognition are fit to exercise authority with integrity. This principle prepares the ground for later discussions of servanthood and biblical authority. Responsibility and the refusal of blame shifting. A defining mark of responsibility in Mitchell's preaching is the rejection of blame shifting. He identifies deflection toward circumstances, systems, or other people as one of the most corrosive habits undermining masculine integrity. Mitchell acknowledges external pressures and injustices, but refuses to allow them to nullify personal responsibility. In his sermons, hardship intensifies responsibility rather than excuses its absence. A responsible man does not deny difficulty, he refuses to let difficulty become justification for moral compromise. This posture stands in contrast to cultural narratives that normalize evasion. Mitchell's vision demands ownership, not perfection, but honesty. Failure, when it occurs, must be acknowledged rather than explained away. This accountability, he argues, is essential for restoration and growth. Responsibility in decision-making. Responsibility manifests most clearly in decision-making. Mitchell emphasizes that men are often positioned as decision-makers, whether in families, communities, or institutions. These decisions carry weight precisely because they affect others. In his sermons, Mitchell stresses that responsible decision-making requires foresight, restraint, and humility. Impulsive choices, driven by emotion or ego, betray immaturity. A responsible man considers consequences before acting and accepts outcomes without resentment. This emphasis connects directly to the discipline discussed in Part 1 and the private formation explored in Part 3. Without internal order, the burden of decision-making becomes overwhelming or corrupting. Responsibility toward others. Mitchell consistently frames responsibility as outward-facing. Masculinity is not self-referential, it is relational. A man's strength is measured by his willingness to bear the cost of protecting, providing, and guiding others. This does not imply authoritarian control. Mitchell is careful to distinguish responsibility from domination. Responsibility seeks the good of others, even at personal cost. It listens, learns, and adapts. It does not demand submission for ego's sake. In family contexts, this means presence rather than mere provision. In leadership contexts, it means stewardship rather than exploitation. In spiritual contexts, it means intercession rather than performance. Responsibility and sacrifice. Sacrifice occupies a central place in Mitchell's understanding of responsibility. To accept responsibility is to accept cost. Responsibility without sacrifice is theoretical. Sacrifice makes responsibility concrete. Mitchell draws heavily on Christological imagery to reinforce this point. Authority expressed through sacrifice is not weakness. It is the highest expression of strength. Biblical manhood, therefore, is cruciform rather than triumphalist. It absorbs cost for the sake of others. This sacrificial orientation prepares men for leadership that does not collapse under pressure. Men who expect comfort from leadership will abandon responsibility when discomfort arrives. Men who expect cost are prepared to endure. The consequences of irresponsibility. Mitchell does not soften the consequences of rejecting responsibility. In his sermons, irresponsibility leads to fractured families, damaged communities, and compromised witness. Leadership failures are rarely sudden. They are the cumulative result of avoided responsibility. This clarity is not punitive, but protective. By naming consequences, Mitchell seeks to awaken seriousness rather than induce shame. Responsibility is framed as the path to trust, stability, and lasting influence. Responsibility as preparation for authority. Responsibility, as Mitchell presents it, is preparatory. It trains men to handle authority without abusing it. Men accustomed to accountability do not fear scrutiny. Men practiced in sacrifice do not cling to control. This preparation is essential for the next stage of Mitchell's teaching. Authority rooted in servanthood. Without responsibility as foundation, servanthood becomes sentimental and authority becomes dangerous. Conclusion. Responsibility as the center of manhood. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons position responsibility not as an accessory to masculinity, but as its center. To be a man, in this vision, is to accept accountability before seeking authority, to carry weight before wielding power, and to embrace sacrifice before demanding recognition. This understanding integrates the themes developed thus far: discipline, moral weight, private formation, and leadership readiness. Responsibility binds them together and directs them outward. With responsibility established as the core of biblical manhood, the discussion now turns to how authority itself must be reimagined, not as control, but as servanthood under God. 5. Rejecting passive masculinity. Silence in the face of responsibility is not humility. It is failure. Having established masculinity as disciplined formation, Part 1, moral weight rather than privilege, Part 2, leadership rooted in private life, Part 3, and responsibility as the core of biblical manhood, Part 4, Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons now confront one of the most pervasive yet least challenged distortions of masculinity: passivity. While much cultural critique focuses on aggressive or toxic masculinity, Mitchell directs equal, if not greater, attention to passive masculinity, which he views as equally destructive, though far less visible. For Mitchell, passivity is not neutrality. It is a moral posture with consequences. A passive man may avoid overt wrongdoing, but he also avoids the burden of action, decision, and accountability. In doing so, he abandons responsibility under the guise of peace, humility, or disengagement. Mitchell's sermons insist that such withdrawal is not virtue, it is abdication. Defining passive masculinity. Passive masculinity, as Mitchell describes it, is not the absence of strength, but the refusal to exercise it. It manifests in avoidance rather than confrontation, silence rather than clarity, and deferral rather than decision. Passive men may appear agreeable, compliant, or non-threatening, but beneath this exterior lies an unwillingness to carry responsibility. Mitchell carefully distinguishes passivity from gentleness. Gentleness is strength under control. Passivity is strength withheld. The passive man does not lack capacity. He lacks resolve. He chooses comfort over calling and safety over stewardship. This distinction is crucial, as passivity often masquerades as virtue. By rejecting overt dominance, passive masculinity can appear morally superior. Mitchell dismantles this illusion by highlighting its consequences: neglected families, compromised leadership, and moral drift. Biblical roots of passivity and its consequences. Mitchell frequently anchors his critique of passivity in biblical narratives, most notably the story of Adam in Genesis. Adam's failure was not an act of aggression, but of silence. He was present yet inactive, aware yet disengaged. Mitchell emphasizes that Adam's sin was not merely disobedience, but abdication of responsibility. This pattern repeats throughout Scripture. Leaders who fail to act decisively allow injustice to flourish. Fathers who withdraw emotionally or spiritually leave formation to chance. In each case, passivity produces harm not through what is done, but through what is left undone. Mitchell's sermons frame these narratives not as historical curiosities, but as warnings. Passivity invites disorder because it creates a vacuum, one that is inevitably filled by chaos, coercion, or collapse. Passivity as fear disguised as peace. A recurring theme in Mitchell's preaching is that passivity is often rooted in fear. Fear of conflict, fear of failure, fear of being disliked, or fear of responsibility itself. Rather than confront these fears honestly, passive masculinity reframes avoidance as wisdom or restraint. Mitchell challenges this reframing directly. Peace that avoids truth is not peace. It is delay. Harmony purchased through silence is temporary and fragile. Responsible masculinity, by contrast, is willing to endure discomfort for the sake of clarity and protection. This insight connects directly to the earlier discussion of emotional regulation. Passive men are not emotionally stable. They are emotionally avoidant. They allow fear to dictate behavior while maintaining an appearance of calm. The cost of passivity in leadership. Passivity is particularly destructive in leadership contexts. Mitchell argues that leaders who refuse to act decisively under pressure betray the trust placed in them. Leadership requires intervention, correction, and sometimes confrontation. Without these, leadership becomes symbolic rather than functional. In his sermons, Mitchell warns that passive leaders often enable dysfunction. By failing to address problems early, they allow them to grow unchecked. The result is not peace, but eventual crisis. Passivity delays conflict. It does not prevent it. This critique reinforces the principle that responsibility cannot coexist with avoidance. Leadership demands engagement, even when engagement risks misunderstanding or resistance. Passivity in family and relational contexts. Mitchell devotes significant attention to the effects of passive masculinity within families. A passive husband or father may provide materially while remaining emotionally or spiritually absent. Such absence, Mitchell argues, creates instability that cannot be compensated for through provision alone. Responsibility in family life requires presence, guidance, and protection. Passive masculinity relinquishes these responsibilities, often leaving others, spouses, children, or institutions, to fill the gap. This transfer of responsibility is neither fair nor sustainable. Mitchell's sermons emphasize that love expressed without leadership becomes neglect. To love responsibly is to act, to guide, and to correct when necessary. Rejecting passivity without embracing aggression. Crucially, Mitchell does not call men to replace passivity with aggression. He rejects both extremes. Aggressive masculinity seeks control. Passive masculinity avoids responsibility. Biblical masculinity, as Mitchell presents it, occupies a demanding middle ground, assertive without domination, decisive without cruelty. This balanced vision draws directly from Christological models of leadership. Christ confronts injustice without violence, speaks truth without manipulation, and accepts suffering without withdrawal. Mitchell presents this model not as abstract theology, but as practical guidance for masculine formation. Courage as a moral discipline. In Mitchell's framework, rejecting passivity requires courage, not as a personality trait, but as a practice discipline. Courage is cultivated through repeated acts of obedience in the face of discomfort. It grows through responsibility, not adrenaline. Mitchell emphasizes that courage often appears unremarkable. It looks like difficult conversations, consistent boundaries, and faithful decision-making. These acts rarely attract attention, but build moral strength over time. This understanding of courage prepares men for authority exercised through servanthood, the focus of the next section. Without courage, servanthood collapses into appeasement. Passivity and moral drift. One of Mitchell's most sobering warnings concerns moral drift. Passivity creates conditions in which standards erode gradually. Without deliberate engagement, values weaken, boundaries blur, and convictions fade. Mitchell argues that moral drift rarely results from intentional rebellion. It more often emerges from neglected responsibility. Men who fail to actively steward their beliefs and commitments eventually find themselves far from where they intended to be. This reinforces the urgency of rejecting passivity as incompatible with biblical manhood. Conclusion: responsibility requires action. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons leave little room for neutral masculinity. Silence, avoidance, and disengagement are not harmless traits. They are failures of responsibility. Rejecting passive masculinity is not about becoming louder or harsher. It is about becoming present, decisive, and accountable. This rejection completes the arc begun in earlier sections. Discipline without action is incomplete. Moral weight without engagement is wasted. Leadership without courage is hollow. Having rejected passivity, Mitchell's teaching now turns to the proper exercise of authority, not as domination, but as servanthood rooted in humility and sacrifice. 6. Authority rooted in servanthood. Biblical authority is not seized, it is carried. Having rejected both domination-based masculinity and passive withdrawal, parts 1 through 5, Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons arrive at a decisive redefinition of authority itself. If masculinity is discipline rather than power, moral weight rather than privilege, leadership formed in private life, responsibility as identity and action rather than passivity, then authority cannot be understood as control. Instead, Mitchell presents authority as servanthood, rooted in humility, expressed through sacrifice, and governed by accountability. This redefinition is not a softening of authority, but a purification of it. Authority, in Mitchell's framework, is neither abandoned nor apologized for. It is redeemed. By anchoring authority in servanthood, Mitchell offers a model that resists both authoritarian abuse and cultural skepticism toward leadership. The cultural crisis of authority. Mitchell situates his teaching within a broader cultural crisis of authority. On one side, authority is distrusted due to repeated abuses of power in political, religious, and familial contexts. On the other, authority is aggressively asserted through coercion, dominance, and entitlement. Both responses, Mitchell argues, stem from a distorted understanding of authority. In his sermons, Mitchell insists that authority itself is not the problem, unaccountable authority is. When authority detaches from service and responsibility, it becomes oppressive. When it detaches from courage and clarity, it becomes irrelevant. Biblical authority avoids both outcomes by grounding leadership in servanthood. Authority as stewardship, not ownership. A central pillar of Mitchell's teaching is that authority is never owned. It is entrusted. Authority does not belong to the individual who exercises it. It belongs to God and is temporarily delegated for the benefit of others. This theological framing transforms authority from a right into a responsibility. Mitchell emphasizes that stewards do not act for self-interest. They act on behalf of another and for the good of those under their care. Authority exercised as stewardship is therefore accountable, limited, and purposeful. It recognizes boundaries and accepts evaluation. This concept builds directly on earlier discussions of responsibility. Only men accustomed to carrying responsibility without recognition can be trusted with authority without corruption. Servanthood as the shape of authority. Servanthood, in Mitchell's sermons, is not the absence of authority but its proper expression. Drawing on Christological models, Mitchell presents Jesus as the definitive example of authority exercised through service. Christ commands, teaches, corrects, and leads, but always for the sake of others, never for self-exaltation. Mitchell is careful to clarify that servanthood does not eliminate hierarchy or decision-making. Leaders still decide. Authority still directs. What changes is orientation. Authority rooted in servanthood asks, who benefits from this decision, rather than who submits to it? This orientation prevents authority from becoming self-referential. Leaders remain accountable to those they serve and to the moral standards governing their role. Authority and the willingness to bear. One of Mitchell's most demanding claims is that legitimate authority always involves cost. Authority rooted in servanthood requires sacrifice of time, comfort, reputation, and sometimes personal ambition. Leaders who seek authority for personal gain reveal their unfitness for it. Mitchell contrasts sacrificial authority with exploitative authority. Exploitative authority extracts value. Sacrificial authority absorbs burden. This distinction is crucial for sustaining trust. Communities instinctively recognize whether authority is exercised for their good or for someone else's advantage. This understanding reinforces the cruciform pattern running through Mitchell's sermons. Authority shaped by the cross resists both tyranny and cowardice. Authority without control. Mitchell repeatedly warns against equating authority with control. Control seeks compliance. Authority seeks alignment. Control enforces behavior. Authority cultivates trust. Control relies on fear. Authority relies on integrity. In his sermons, Mitchell argues that leaders obsessed with control often reveal insecurity rather than strength. Servant authority, by contrast, is confident enough to empower others rather than dominate them. It delegates, develops, and multiplies leadership rather than hoarding influence. This distinction directly addresses fears that servanthood weakens authority. Mitchell insists that true authority grows stronger through service because it generates voluntary trust rather than forced submission. Authority and accountability. Accountability remains central to Mitchell's understanding of authority. Leaders who serve are not exempt from correction. They are especially subject to it. Authority that refuses accountability ceases to be biblical. Mitchell emphasizes that accountability protects both leaders and those they lead. It prevents isolation, exposes blind spots, and reinforces humility. Leaders rooted in servanthood welcome accountability because it aligns with their orientation toward stewardship rather than ownership. This principle reinforces the continuity of Mitchell's framework. Discipline, responsibility, action, and servanthood form a coherent system rather than isolated virtues. Authority in family, church, and community. Mitchell applies his vision of servant authority across relational contexts. In families, authority expresses itself through presence, guidance, and protection rather than domination. In churches, leadership functions through teaching, correction, and pastoral care rather than control. In communities, authority seeks justice and stability rather than recognition. Across these contexts, Mitchell maintains the same standard. Authority exists to serve those entrusted to it. Any authority that prioritizes ego, comfort, or reputation over people forfeits its legitimacy. Authority as preparation for legacy. Authority rooted in servanthood also shapes legacy. Leaders who serve rather than dominate create environments where others grow. Their influence extends beyond their tenure through the people they have formed. Mitchell contrasts this with authority driven by control, which leaves behind dependency or resentment. Servant authority leaves behind maturity, stability, and trust, conditions necessary for long-term flourishing. Conclusion. Authority. Worth trusting. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons present a vision of authority desperately needed in a skeptical age. Authority is not abandoned, but redeemed, not diluted, but disciplined. Rooted in servanthood, authority becomes a moral vocation rather than a power grab. This vision completes the arc from masculinity as discipline to leadership as service. Men formed by responsibility, courage, and private integrity are prepared to exercise authority without abusing it. Authority, in this framework, is not something to pursue, but something to be entrusted, after formation has done its work. With authority now reimagined through servanthood, the next discussion turns inward again, examining emotional strength, not as suppression, but as mastery essential for sustaining leadership over time. 7. Masculinity under God, not above others. A man who fears God has no need to dominate people. After redefining masculinity as discipline rather than power, Part 1, moral weight rather than privilege, Part 2, leadership formed in private life, Part 3, responsibility as identity, Part 4, the rejection of passivity, Part 5, and authority rooted in servanthood, Part 6. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons now clarify the theological axis that holds all these elements together. Masculinity must be exercised under God, never above others. This distinction is foundational. Without it, masculinity inevitably drifts toward domination, control, or self-justification. Mitchell argues that when men lose a proper fear of God, they compensate by asserting power over people. Conversely, when a man lives under divine authority, he no longer needs to prove himself through dominance. Submission to God becomes the source of restraint, humility, and moral clarity. The vertical order of masculinity. Mitchell's theology of masculinity is fundamentally vertical before it is horizontal. A man's primary relationship is not to society, family, or institutions, but to God. This vertical orientation determines how masculinity is expressed in every other relationship. In his sermons, Mitchell emphasizes that authority always flows downward from God. Men do not generate authority from within themselves. They receive it conditionally. This theological ordering dismantles the myth of autonomous masculinity. The idea that a man defines himself by willpower, strength, or self-assertion alone. By placing masculinity under God, Mitchell reframes power as stewardship and strength as obedience. Masculinity ceases to be self-referential and becomes accountable. Fear of God as the anchor of manhood. A central theme in Mitchell's preaching is the fear of God, not terror, but reverent submission. The fear of God establishes moral boundaries that no social system can enforce consistently. It reminds men that they are answerable even when no human authority is present. Mitchell argues that many failures of masculinity stem not from a lack of confidence, but from a lack of reverence. Men who no longer fear God begin to fear insignificance, weakness, or loss of control. These fears often manifest as domination, defensiveness, or withdrawal. In contrast, the man who fears God does not need to dominate others to feel secure. His identity is anchored beyond social validation. This stability enables humility without weakness and authority without arrogance. Domination as theological disorder. Mitchell does not treat domination merely as a social or psychological problem. He identifies it as a theological disorder. Domination occurs when men invert the proper order, placing themselves above others rather than under God. In his sermons, Mitchell highlights how domination often masquerades as leadership. Demanding obedience, enforcing control, or silencing dissent may appear strong, but these behaviors reveal insecurity rather than authority. They signal that a man has replaced divine accountability with self-authorization. This critique applies across contexts: family, church, and culture. Whenever masculinity asserts itself through coercion rather than service, it betrays a failure of submission. Submission to God as the source of humility. Mitchell consistently reframes humility not as self-deprecation, but as right positioning. A man under God understands his limits, his accountability, and his dependence. This awareness does not weaken masculinity, it grounds it. Humility, in this framework, is not passivity. It does not avoid responsibility or leadership. Instead, it prevents authority from becoming self-serving. A humble man can lead decisively because his decisions are not driven by ego. This understanding builds on the rejection of passivity in Part 5. Submission to God empowers action rather than inhibiting it. The man under God acts with confidence precisely because he does not act for self-exaltation. Masculinity without comparison. One of the subtle consequences of living under God is freedom from comparison. Mitchell notes that much masculine insecurity arises from measuring oneself against others, status, success, strength, or recognition. When masculinity is grounded vertically, comparison loses its power. A man no longer needs to outperform others to justify himself. His value is derived from obedience rather than dominance. This freedom has profound relational implications. Men who do not compete for validation are less likely to manipulate, intimidate, or withdraw. They can affirm others' strengths without feeling diminished. Authority without superiority. Mitchell's sermons repeatedly emphasize that authority does not imply superiority. Authority exists for function, not hierarchy of worth. A man under God understands that leadership roles do not elevate his value over others. This conviction prevents the dehumanization that often accompanies unchecked authority. Leaders who see themselves as superior eventually treat others as expendable. Servant authority, by contrast, recognizes equal dignity under God. This principle reinforces the servant leadership model introduced in Part 6. Authority exercised under God remains relational, accountable, and compassionate. Masculinity and moral boundaries. Submission to God also establishes non-negotiable moral boundaries. Mitchell stresses that masculinity under God is constrained by divine standards, not personal preference or cultural trends. These boundaries protect both leaders and communities. They prevent rationalization, excuse-making, and ethical drift. Men who operate without transcendent boundaries inevitably redefine morality to suit convenience. Mitchell's insistence on moral limits prepares the ground for emotional mastery, the focus of the next section. Without moral boundaries, emotional expression becomes unregulated and destructive. The relational impact of vertical submission. Mitchell argues that men who live under God create safer relational environments. Their authority does not threaten, it stabilizes. Their leadership does not intimidate, it invites trust. This relational safety is not produced by technique, but by theology. When others sense that a man answers to a higher authority, they experience his leadership as less arbitrary and more reliable. Conclusion: strength that kneels. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons present a vision of masculinity that kneels before it stands. Masculinity under God does not diminish strength, it disciplines it. It does not erase authority, it redeems it. By placing masculinity under God rather than above others, Mitchell resolves the tension between strength and humility, authority and compassion. Men no longer need to dominate to lead or withdraw to remain virtuous. They are free to act decisively while remaining accountable. This vertical grounding prepares the final interior dimension of masculinity, emotional strength, not the suppression of emotion, but its mastery under moral authority. 8. Emotional strength. Without emotional fragility. Strength is not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of it. Having established masculinity as disciplined formation, Part 1, moral weight, Part 2, privately formed leadership, Part 3, responsibility as identity, Part 4, decisive engagement rather than passivity, Part 5, authority rooted in servanthood, Part 6, and masculinity ordered under God, Part 7, Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons now turn inward to a dimension often misunderstood or neglected in discussions of biblical manhood: emotional strength. Mitchell does not call men to emotional silence, nor does he affirm emotional impulsivity. Instead, he presents a demanding middle path, emotional strength without emotional fragility. In this framework, emotions are neither denied nor enthroned. They are acknowledged, disciplined, and integrated under moral authority. Emotional maturity, for Mitchell, is not optional. It is essential for sustaining leadership, responsibility, and authority over time. The cultural confusion around male emotion. Contemporary culture sends conflicting messages about male emotion. On one hand, men are encouraged to express feelings freely, often without guidance on discernment or restraint. On the other, traditional expectations still reward emotional suppression, equating restraint with stoicism. Mitchell critiques both extremes. Emotional suppression produces distance, resentment, and eventual breakdown. Emotional indulgence produces instability, inconsistency, and relational harm. Neither posture reflects biblical manhood. In his sermons, Mitchell argues that the real issue is not whether men feel deeply, but whether they are governed by what they feel. Emotional fragility emerges when emotions dictate behavior rather than inform it. Defining emotional strength. Emotional strength, as Mitchell defines it, is the capacity to experience emotion fully without surrendering moral agency. A strong man feels fear without fleeing responsibility, anger without becoming destructive, sorrow without despair, and joy without losing discipline. This definition reframes emotional maturity as a form of self-governance, an extension of the discipline discussed in earlier sections. Emotional strength is not innate temperament. It is cultivated through intentional formation. Mitchell repeatedly emphasizes that leadership collapses when emotional fragility takes control. Leaders who react impulsively, personalize criticism, or avoid difficult conversations due to discomfort erode trust and stability. Emotional fragility as a leadership liability. Emotional fragility manifests when emotions overwhelm discernment. Mitchell identifies several recurring patterns: defensiveness when challenged, volatility under pressure, withdrawal in conflict, and reactivity driven by insecurity. Such fragility, Mitchell argues, is often misinterpreted as sensitivity or authenticity. In reality, it reflects an inability to bear emotional weight. Leaders who cannot regulate their emotions place the burden of stability on others. This insight builds directly on Part 4's discussion of responsibility. Emotional fragility shifts responsibility outward. Emotional strength absorbs pressure rather than displacing it. The role of self-awareness. Mitchell places significant emphasis on self-awareness as a prerequisite for emotional strength. Men must learn to recognize their emotional patterns, triggers, and vulnerabilities without being ruled by them. Self-awareness, however, is not self-absorption. Mitchell warns against introspection detached from moral purpose. Awareness serves formation only when it leads to responsibility, repentance, and restraint. A man who understands his emotional tendencies is better equipped to act wisely rather than react instinctively. This capacity is essential for leadership under pressure. Emotional regulation and the fear of God. Building on Part 7, Mitchell connects emotional mastery to submission under God. Reverence establishes a higher reference point than emotional impulse. When men fear God, emotions lose their absolute authority. Mitchell argues that many emotional outbursts stem from threatened ego rather than genuine conviction. Submission to God humbles ego and stabilizes emotion. The man under God does not need to defend himself emotionally because his identity is not self-generated. This theological grounding prevents emotional expression from becoming self-justification. Anger, courage, and moral clarity. Mitchell gives particular attention to anger, one of the most potent and misunderstood emotions. He does not condemn anger outright. Instead, he distinguishes between righteous anger and reactive anger. Righteous anger is anchored in moral clarity and directed toward injustice. Reactive anger arises from wounded pride or fear. Emotional strength lies in discerning the difference. Mitchell emphasizes that leaders must be capable of anger without violence and conviction without cruelty. Suppressed anger corrodes character. Uncontrolled anger destroys trust. Vulnerability without instability. Mitchell also addresses vulnerability, a concept often celebrated but rarely disciplined. Vulnerability without emotional regulation can burden others and destabilize leadership. Vulnerability with discipline fosters trust. A strong man, in Mitchell's framework, can acknowledge weakness without surrendering authority. He can confess struggle without seeking validation. This balance prevents vulnerability from becoming emotional exhibitionism. Emotional endurance over time. One of the most critical dimensions of emotional strength is endurance. Leadership is not sustained by intensity, but by consistency. Emotional fragility exhausts both leaders and those they lead. Mitchell stresses that emotionally strong men develop resilience, the capacity to remain steady amid criticism, loss, or uncertainty. This steadiness does not mean emotional numbness, it means emotional durability. This endurance prepares leaders to navigate cultural confusion, the focus of the next section. Emotional strength as protection against burnout. Mitchell identifies emotional fragility as a major contributor to burnout. Leaders who internalize every criticism or derive identity from affirmation eventually collapse. Emotional strength establishes boundaries between role and self. By grounding identity under God rather than public response, emotionally strong men can engage fully without being consumed. Conclusion: governed hearts, steady hands. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons present emotional strength as indispensable to biblical masculinity. Emotions are not enemies to be silenced, nor masters to be obeyed. They are signals to be interpreted under moral authority. Emotional strength completes the interior formation required for sustained leadership. Discipline governs behavior. Responsibility anchors purpose. Servanthood shapes authority. Submission grounds identity. And emotional mastery sustains them all. With this internal dimension clarified, the next discussion turns outward once more. How such formed men lead faithfully within a culture increasingly confused about masculinity, authority, and truth. 9. Leadership in a culture of confusion. When culture blurs manhood, responsibility becomes rebellion. Having established emotional strength as a necessary internal discipline, Part 8, Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons now confront the external environment in which biblical masculinity and leadership must operate. That environment, Mitchell argues, is not neutral. It is a culture marked by confusion. Confusion about truth, authority, identity, responsibility, and especially masculinity. Leadership in such a context is no longer merely difficult. It is inherently countercultural. For Mitchell, The challenge is not simply that society rejects biblical definitions of manhood, but that it actively replaces them with unstable, contradictory narratives. To lead faithfully in such a culture requires clarity, courage, and moral resilience. The nature of cultural confusion. Mitchell describes cultural confusion not as intellectual ignorance, but as moral disorientation. Modern society, in his analysis, has lost a shared moral grammar. Terms such as strength, authority, responsibility, and even manhood are simultaneously contested and hollowed out. This confusion manifests in two dominant tendencies. The first is relativism, where truth becomes subjective and authority is viewed with suspicion. The second is performative certainty, where individuals assert identity and conviction loudly but without grounding or accountability. Mitchell argues that leadership collapses when these tendencies dominate. Relativism erodes conviction, while performative certainty produces arrogance without wisdom. Masculinity under suspicion. One of the most acute dimensions of cultural confusion concerns masculinity itself. Mitchell observes that contemporary discourse often oscillates between caricature and erasure. Masculinity is either portrayed as inherently toxic or rendered meaningless through endless redefinition. In this climate, men are often uncertain about what is expected of them. Responsibility is blurred, authority is delegitimized, and moral expectations are inconsistent. Mitchell insists that this confusion does not liberate men, it paralyzes them. Biblical leadership, therefore, does not emerge by adapting masculinity to cultural trends, but by restoring clarity where confusion reigns. Leadership as moral clarity, not cultural approval. Mitchell consistently rejects the idea that leadership should be shaped by cultural acceptance. In his sermons, leadership begins with moral clarity, not popularity. Leaders are called to discern truth, not to mirror consensus. This principle directly extends earlier discussions of responsibility, Part 4, and authority, Part 6. Leadership in Mitchell's framework involves standing firm amid pressure to compromise. Cultural confusion tests whether leaders derive identity from approval or conviction. A leader shaped by cultural affirmation will inevitably drift. A leader anchored under God, Part 7, remains steady even when misunderstood. Navigating polarization without compromise. Cultural confusion often expresses itself through polarization. Mitchell identifies this as another threat to faithful leadership. Polarization reduces complex moral realities into binary conflicts, forcing leaders to choose sides rather than seek truth. Mitchell warns that biblical leadership cannot be reduced to reactionary positions. Reaction, by definition, surrenders initiative. Leaders who define themselves by opposition rather than conviction become trapped by the very culture they resist. Instead, Mitchell advocates principled engagement, holding firm convictions while resisting the temptation to dehumanize opponents. This approach demands emotional strength, Part 8, and humility under God, Part 7. Responsibility as resistance. One of Mitchell's most striking assertions is that responsibility itself becomes an act of resistance in a confused culture. When society encourages avoidance, victimhood, or perpetual grievance, choosing responsibility is countercultural. Mitchell argues that leadership begins with personal responsibility before it ever addresses societal change. Men who govern themselves, lead their families, and serve their communities challenge cultural confusion simply by embodying order. This form of resistance is quiet but profound. It does not seek attention, yet it exposes the instability of cultural narratives that deny responsibility. Authority. Without domination. Cultural confusion also distorts perceptions of authority. Authority is often equated with oppression, control, or abuse. In response, many leaders retreat into passivity to avoid accusation. Mitchell confronts this fear directly. Authority, he insists, is not inherently abusive. It becomes destructive only when detached from servanthood, Part 6, and submission to God, Part 7. In a confused culture, leaders must reclaim authority without domination, exercising influence grounded in moral credibility rather than force. This requires confidence rooted in calling, not insecurity. Leadership amid moral ambiguity. Mitchell acknowledges that leaders today operate in morally ambiguous environments. Clear answers are not always immediately available. However, ambiguity must not be confused with moral paralysis. Mitchell emphasizes discernment over certainty. Discernment involves patience, wisdom, and humility, while still committing to action. Leaders must be willing to act imperfectly, rather than hide behind indecision. This posture builds on the rejection of passive masculinity, discussed in Part 5. Indecision born of fear is not wisdom. It is abdication. Formation over reaction. A recurring theme in Mitchell's sermons is the danger of reactive leadership. Cultural confusion provokes strong emotional responses: anger, fear, outrage. Leaders who react impulsively amplify confusion rather than resolve it. Mitchell insists that leadership must be rooted in formation rather than reaction. Formation establishes habits of thought, prayer, discipline, and accountability that stabilize leaders before crises emerge. This emphasis ties together all previous sections: discipline, Part 1, moral weight, Part 2, private integrity, Part 3, responsibility, Part 4, decisiveness, Part 5, servanthood, Part 6, submission, Part 7, and emotional mastery, Part 8. Courage without hostility. Leadership in a confused culture requires courage, but Mitchell distinguishes courage from hostility. Hostility seeks to defeat opponents. Courage seeks to uphold truth. Mitchell warns that hostility often masks insecurity. Leaders who are certain of their grounding do not need to shout or shame. Their steadiness communicates authority more effectively than aggression. This distinction is crucial in a cultural climate saturated with outrage. Courageous leadership remains firm without becoming cruel. Preparing for legacy. As this section concludes, Mitchell turns implicitly toward the future. Leadership in a confused culture is not primarily about winning arguments, but about shaping inheritance. The question is not how loudly leaders speak, but what kind of men and communities they produce. This forward-looking perspective prepares the transition to the final section. If masculinity and leadership are formed amid confusion, their ultimate measure will not be cultural recognition, but enduring legacy. Conclusion. Clarity as calling. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons present leadership in a culture of confusion as a calling that demands clarity, courage, and consistency. Leaders must resist both assimilation and antagonism, choosing instead principled faithfulness. In a world uncertain about manhood, responsibility, and authority, clarity itself becomes leadership. Such clarity is not self-generated. It flows from submission to God, disciplined formation, emotional strength, and moral conviction. With this cultural challenge articulated, the final section turns to the ultimate question: how this vision of masculinity and leadership is measured not by performance, but by the legacy it leaves behind. 10. Masculinity as legacy, not performance. The true measure of a man is not applause, but inheritance. After examining the formation of masculinity, Parts 1 and 2, the private disciplines that sustain leadership, Part 3, responsibility as moral identity, Part 4, the rejection of passivity, Part 5, authority rooted in servanthood, Part 6, submission under God, Part 7, emotional strength, Part 8, and leadership amid cultural confusion, Part 9, Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons ultimately direct attention to a single evaluative horizon: legacy. For Mitchell, masculinity is not assessed by visibility, platform, or public validation. It is assessed by what remains when the man himself is no longer present. Legacy in this framework is not a branding outcome. It is the cumulative result of disciplined obedience over time. Performance culture and the illusion of success. Mitchell situates his teaching within a culture obsessed with performance. Modern masculinity is often measured by metrics: influence, income, social media presence, charisma, and perceived dominance. Leadership, likewise, is evaluated through visibility and immediacy. Mitchell critiques this paradigm as fundamentally short-sighted. Performance culture rewards what is impressive in the moment, not what is faithful across decades. It prioritizes optics over substance and speed over endurance. In such a culture, men are tempted to confuse momentum with maturity and recognition with responsibility. Mitchell's sermons consistently dismantle this illusion by recentering masculinity on long-term impact rather than short-term affirmation. Legacy as an ethical category. Legacy, as Mitchell frames it, is not sentimental remembrance, but ethical inheritance. It refers to the values, habits, and structures a man transmits to others, intentionally or otherwise. This concept builds directly on Part 4's emphasis on responsibility. Every man, Mitchell argues, leaves a legacy. The only question is whether that legacy is constructive or corrosive. Leadership, therefore, carries an inescapable generational dimension. Decisions made in private reverberate far beyond the individual lifespan. The slow work of faithfulness. Mitchell repeatedly emphasizes that legacy is formed through repetition rather than intensity. Faithfulness is rarely dramatic. It is expressed in consistency, showing up, telling the truth, honoring commitments, and enduring obscurity. This stands in stark contrast to performance-driven masculinity, which seeks recognition and rapid results. Mitchell insists that the most significant contributions of a man's life often go unnoticed in the moment. Legacy requires patience, the willingness to invest in outcomes one may never fully witness. Masculinity that outlives the man. Mitchell's sermons challenge men to envision masculinity that outlives them. This vision reframes ambition. The question is no longer, how successful am I, but what kind of men and women are formed because of my presence. This perspective integrates earlier discussions of leadership in private life, Part 3, and authority through servanthood, Part 6. Influence rooted in service produces continuity, not dependency. A legacy-oriented man prepares others to stand without him. The role of fatherhood, biological and spiritual. Mitchell gives particular attention to fatherhood as a primary vehicle of legacy. However, he expands the concept beyond biology. Fatherhood in his sermons includes mentorship, discipleship, and spiritual formation. Men who lead without reproducing values leave institutions without foundations. Mitchell warns that charisma without succession is a failure of leadership. Legacy, therefore, demands intentional investment in people rather than personal platforms. Accountability as a legacy practice. One of Mitchell's more countercultural assertions is that accountability itself is part of legacy. Men who submit to correction model humility for future generations. This principle reinforces submission under God, Part 7, and emotional strength, Part 8. Leaders unwilling to be accountable transmit insecurity and fear rather than confidence. Legacy is shaped not only by what men teach, but by how they respond when confronted. Leadership beyond one's lifetime. Mitchell challenges the assumption that leadership ends with retirement or death. Structures, cultures, and habits endure long after individuals depart. This awareness introduces moral gravity to leadership decisions. Short-term gains that undermine long-term integrity are exposed as legacy failures. Leaders must ask whether their methods can be sustained ethically by those who follow. The quiet nature of true legacy. Mitchell emphasizes that authentic legacy is often invisible. It does not seek applause. It manifests in stable families, resilient communities, and principled leaders shaped indirectly. This quietness distinguishes legacy from reputation. Reputation depends on perception. Legacy depends on transformation. Men who live for legacy accept that their most important work may never be publicly attributed to them. Measuring success through inheritance. Mitchell proposes an alternative metric for success: inheritance. What beliefs, habits, and moral frameworks are passed on? This reframing confronts performance-based masculinity directly. A man may be celebrated publicly, yet leave chaos privately. Conversely, a man unknown to history may leave a lineage of integrity. Legacy redefines victory. Legacy in a confused culture. Returning to the cultural confusion addressed in Part 9, Mitchell argues that legacy-oriented masculinity offers stability amid uncertainty. While cultural narratives shift, inherited values provide continuity. Men who prioritize legacy resist cultural volatility. Their lives become reference points for truth and responsibility when language and norms fluctuate. Conclusion: faithfulness as final measure. Philip Anthony Mitchell's sermons culminate in a sober but hopeful vision. Masculinity measured not by performance, but by faithfulness. Leadership evaluated not by visibility, but by inheritance. Legacy is the final audit of a man's life. It reveals whether discipline produced character, whether authority served others, whether responsibility was embraced, and whether leadership endured beyond applause. In a world fixated on the immediate, Mitchell calls men to live for what lasts. Masculinity, rightly understood, is not a performance to be watched. It is a legacy to be lived and left behind.